Hello, guys. Welcome back to the Pokepreet podcast. Today, we're joined by the special guest, Vinay Lal. I absolutely love his historical videos. He's a professor at UCLA. Henry's going to be mostly doing this podcast interview since I'm going to have to leave in about 40 minutes. But so good to have you on, Professor Lal. Could you just introduce yourself super quick?
Yes, well, I'm a professor of history and Asian American studies at UCLA, and in fact, I'm completing 32 years in the same department and at the same university. And just to give a slightly more elaborate glimpse into my background, but my doctorate is in South Asian languages and civilizations, and I should say that everybody refers to me as a historian, but I don't have a single degree in history, although I teach in a history department. So that's another interesting story. But I work in a wide variety of disciplines, and history is perhaps preeminent among them. But I also work in literature and philosophy and cinema studies, um, and so on. So I think that should suffice for the moment.
Yeah, it absolutely does. One of the first things we sort of always like to ask is like, how did you get into your field? How did you get here? So, like, what originally interested you in sort of pursuing this path? And was there any specific like topic that put you on it?
Well, uh, so look, I mean, I'm in my 60s, so I have to go back to, to my undergraduate days. I commenced my undergraduate degree in 1978 at Johns Hopkins University. And actually, I'm probably one of the very few academics who doesn't have a degree in any discipline. By which I mean the following: that I don't have a major. I didn't have a major for my BA, and I ended up studying history, literature, and philosophy. My bachelor's degree and my master's degree, both conferred in the same year, that is 1982, were awarded by the Humanities Center at Johns Hopkins University. And then I mentioned before that I have a doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations from the University of Chicago. So, how did I end up where I am? Well, partly it's really by accident, frankly.
Mm.
I have, as I said, for so many years, I've encountered hundreds, thousands of students, and a lot of the history students tell me they have an absolute passion for what they do. Well, I don't know if I really had a passion for any particular discipline, to be quite honest, because when I applied for my doctorate, I recall distinctly, to I think 8 universities, and there were 8 different departments. So I applied, for example, to Oriental Studies at Oxford, to South Asian Studies at University of Chicago, to History at UC Berkeley, and so on. And then ended up going to University of Chicago because that's where I had the best offer. So I didn't really go with the intention of studying history per se, and ended up working with a person who I think fairly can be described as one of the two or three most preeminent American scholars who ever worked on Indian history, on modern Indian history, particularly the British period, and that's Bernard Cohn,
Mm.
who was a major figure, and you know, dozens of students, many of whom then went on to occupy places and leading universities, all trained under him. I was among the last students who studied with him. So that I think is roughly the trajectory. But just to give you an illustration that things could have gone in a very different way. I mean, I also studied cinema for a period of time. I had what's called the Thomas Watson Fellowship, and I went to Australia after I finished my BA and MA, and spent some time in India. And I was really, studying cinema for a year or two, and then finally came back to the U.S. in 1984 to start my doctorate. But now I've been there for 32 years, and as I said, I mean, preeminently now I work really in the domain of what we could call social cultural, intellectual, and political history. I don't work really in economic history or military history, for example, but I do work in wide areas of social, cultural, political, intellectual history, and not just the history of India. At the moment, for example, I'm teaching a course on called Contemporary World History. And contemporary world history, the word contemporary here actually um, means the modern world rather than simply the present moment. And again, when the modern world began is intellectually an interesting question. But the segment I teach begins roughly with the Industrial Revolution and takes us down to the present day. So we're speaking about roughly a 300-year span of time, you know.
Hmm.
So that's kind of a rough overview and some sense of the trajectory that led me to where I am at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting that you highlighted that you focused on so many different spheres of interest, because that's something that I think to me really stuck out about your a lot of your discussions on South Asia. You're able to I sort of hate the word discursive for some reason, but that is a very good way to describe it. You'll kind of recognize patterns in films, and then jump to textual examples, and it really adds a lot of depth to it. So and I'm sure many other people appreciate that. And to move on to a more specific question about the history of India as a nation state, obviously from a distance, the big major political change has been the emergence of Hindu nationalism, and early on, there's this impression that India was a nominally secular nation state, and people like Jawaharlal Nehru were focused on building a secular nation state, which wasn't connected to Hinduism, Islam, and so on. And then, of course, the BJP and a number of other political forces. It kind of, my impression is in the 90s, kind of emerged. And today, of course, the BJP is the largest party, and Hindu nationalism is one of the largest forces in Indian politics. So, how might you kind of trace this? Can you see this? Of course, you can see it in certain groups from the very beginning, but how did this kind of larger scale transition take place on a higher level? Although, of course, it's very difficult to say anything briefly about that.
Yeah. I mean, can I take like 5-10 minutes on this to answer this, or do you want a much briefer answer?
No, no, feel free
Five,
to.
10 minutes sounds awesome. Yeah.
Okay. Let me go back to the 1920s. So let's say a century ago, because when we go back to the 1920s, we begin to see the emergence of such organizations as the Hindu Mahasabha. And if you look at contemporary political discourse on Hindu nationalism, you'll see lots of references, both by the advocates of Hindutva and by the opponents of Hindutva. You'll see references to such people as Savarkar, Vinayak Savarkar, and then references to Golwalkar and subsequently Hedgewar. So who are these three? These people, these three are all three of them are Maharashtrian Brahmins. Let's underscore that fact and just try to keep it in our mind. It is important that they're Maharashtrian Brahmins uh, because, of course, it tells us that they came from their upper caste. And not only are they upper caste, but they come from a certain part of India, that is Maharashtra. What is now called Maharashtra, it wasn't really called Maharashtra. I mean, very broadly, you can think of it as Maratha country if you want, but it was part of the Bombay presidency, as it used to be known in colonial India. Now, why is that important? Just to give you one sense of it, we're not going to do a thorough intellectual history that will take hours, but to give you one instance of it, if you're looking at Hindutva today, you can also think of it as a muscular form of Hindu nationalism, okay? A militant form of Hindu nationalism. Now, the in the late 1920s, these people whom I've referred were advocating precisely for that. And there are so many different angles through which one can understand that. So, for example, the whole mythography. I use the word mythography rather than myth. I don't like the word myth for lots of reasons, because that word is a word of abuse now. When people say, "Oh, such and such thing is a myth," but let us remember that civilizations, including India and Greece, began with, as it were, a huge body of mythic material. One of the things that informs Indian civilization is this massive repository of what we can call mythic material. And myths were crucial in the formation of the Greek imagination. Okay, when we think about what the West has inherited from Greece, people who are learned usually think of Plato and Aristotle, and then they think of the writers of the tragedies, Aeschylus, of Euripides, and so on. But it's the world of Greek myths which is critically important. So I won't use that word at all. But mythography is a different word. That the word here, which is what is it that happened in the 1920s? A whole elaborate mythography was established about the masculinity, and muscular nature of resistance offered by somebody called Shivaji, and then the Marathas. Okay, this became an important part of a developing Indian historiography. This is still very much invoked by the advocates of Hindu nationalism today. So we have to go back to the late 1920s. Now, let's fast forward a bit, which is that, and here again, there's a very intricate debate which I can't get into it, but I just simply mention it, namely that apart from the development of organizations such as the Hindu Mahasabha, which began to advocate for, let's use that phrase, a Hindu nation state. Okay, so what is it that Savarkar is advocating for in his book on Hindutva, on the essentials of Hindutva? He's talking about India as a Hindu nation state. Okay, it's uh, the land where everyone, even a Muslim, should be aware of that they're living in a land which is essentially the land of Hindus. That is, I'm simplifying the argument, but that's in essence what Savarkar is going to say. And he's also going to uh, write a book, which is really the first works written by an Indian, frankly, on the 1857 rebellion. Okay, what used to be called in the colonial records as Sepoy Mutiny. So it's the 1857-58 rebellion, which is the most determined form of resistance to colonial rule. Eventually, the British did crush it, but it did pose a threat to British rule. And so he writes a book called The First War of Indian Independence, right? And the title is very interesting too, there, because of course he's also invoking the imagery of the American War of Independence. All right. So Savarkar has laid out the essentials of many of the arguments we're going to encounter today. But as I was about to say, if we fast forward a little bit, there are those historians who have argued that apart from organizations such as the Hindu Mahasabha and another organization called the RSS, which is a Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, which sort of the anodyne translation into English is the National Volunteer Corps. What it is it's a, people used to think of it as a paramilitary organization that did the ideological work of Hindu nationalism. Okay. And it's important to underscore again the fact that there are many people in the current government in the highest positions who are lifelong members of the RSS. All right, I want to just mention that. So, apart from these organizations, some historians have argued that the Indian National Congress, which was a secular organization, that this organization itself began to be somewhat communalized, that some there was some infiltration of the Congress by the extreme Hindu elements. All right. And as I said, this is a subject for a very long discussion, so we can't get into that, but it's important to register the fact that certainly, I would say that certainly some left liberal historians would take the view that the Congress wasn't entirely secular, certainly not in the 1930s and moving into the 1940s. And then, of course, in the 1940s, you have, the independence of India, the partition, the emergence of a new nation state. All right. Now, what happens to the RSS? Okay, and these Hindu organizations. Gandhi is assassinated on 30th January 1948. Mohandas Gandhi is assassinated, right? And the assassin, Nathuram Godse, is a member of the RSS. He clearly advocates for the same ideological positions that people like Savarkar had. In fact, Savarkar was, I think it's fair to say, his mentor. Uh, and it's again another long story, but the government of India didn't just put Nathuram Godse on trial. They alleged that there was a whole conspiracy to assassinate Gandhi, and a number of people were convicted. Savarkar was among those who were tried, but he was not convicted. He was not convicted, but a number of other people were convicted, and 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 a consequence of this assassination was a certain kind of revulsion against these organizations came into Indian society. The Indian state, no doubt, headed at this point by Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a prime minister, and the deputy prime minister, who was also the home minister, was Sardar Patel, Vallabhai Patel, who, along with Nehru, had been considered one of Gandhi's right hand men. Okay, uh, th- these two and many others in the Indian government, they felt that the Hindu right wing, that is, these extremist groups, had an assassinating Gandhi, so to speak. Now, when I say in assassinating, of course, a trigger is pulled by Nathuram Godse, but the implication is that there were people who belong to the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha and other formations who were joyous on hearing this news, and that these people should now have to pay for what had been done. Okay, and in fact, Patel, who was sometimes accused by the liberals of being too soft on these Hindu nationalists, and was sometimes it was they alleged that he was himself actually too much of a Hindu nationalist. Patel said very clearly that these people, the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha people, they have spread a poison in Indian society. So, what's the implication? The implication is the RSS is going to be banned. The official ban lasts only a year or so. It's not very long, but they are in a way ostracized for a period of time. If I may put it this way, they go into the wilderness. They go into the wilderness. Okay. And then 50s and 60s. So let's go back to portions of what the question was. That is it true to say that this period was characterized largely by a kind of a secular disposition? Well, I would say yes. I mean, Arundhati Roy would say no, India was never really secular. But of course, she has, her position on many questions, which is not necessarily the position even of those who are, liberal minded or roughly, adhere to the view that look, that the period under Nehru, that is from 1947 until his death in May 1964, and for some years after that. That is at least moving into the late 60s, early 1970s, the stamp of secularism remained very strong. I think one way to understand it is this. Let's supposing that one didn't adhere to the view that the Indian state was, you know, always staunchly secularist. Let's take that view for a moment, for argument's sake. I would argue that even if you took that view, it is still correct to say that a secular ethos was part of the upbringing of most people, including myself. I'm born in 1961. Okay. So Nehru was alive at that time. When I started going to school, okay, and into my teens, was I aware of the fact that so and so is a Muslim, or that Muslims think very differently than we, quote, Hindus do? Okay. I'm just putting it in a very anecdotal way. Now, what I'm saying is that if you think of it in this way, I think it is correct to say that a certain kind of secular ethos had become part of the fabric of Indian life. I'm speaking here about urban India. Let me also mention that, because in rural India there is no question that a certain kind of secularism had always prevailed. Nobody called it secularism. It wasn't secularism of the modern sort, but it is a demonstrably proven fact. There's insurmountable evidence that communal animosity in India is more an urban problem, far more so an urban problem than a rural problem. Which is not to say that a person in rural India does not think of himself or herself preeminently as a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh or whatever they may be. They may think that way, but that didn't preclude them from thinking of people who belong to other religious faiths as part of their same moral universe. Okay. And this is what I meant, that in that rural India, in fact, secularism was far more so a part of the ethos of everyday life. And that is a certain kind of way in which people inhabited the same space. Yes, there were areas of segregation. There always were. I think one should be aware of that. But this was not state mandated segregation either. This is simply the fact that Hindus kept to themselves for in some spheres of life, and Muslims did so, and then there were other spheres of life where they mixed. Okay, so, and then we get to the last stage now, which is the rise of Hindu nationalism. And that is, of course, a very long story. I've given you the roots of it now, going back to the 1920s. But part of the problem that we have to think about is we have to think about this disease. And what is a disease? It's called the nation state. The nation state is a diseased entity no matter where it is in the world. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is you cannot have a nation state without a violence. No nation state became a nation state without perpetrating violence. And who does it perpetrate violence upon? It perpetrates violence upon all those who are the other in various ways. You know, you just look at just look at how the United States became a nation state. You look at how France became a nation state, how Germany became a nation state. Okay, and we can see that that forms of violence are endemic to the making of a nation state. This means what? Now let's follow the implications of that. That a nation state always tends towards homogeneity. Right? And this was the fundamental attempt, frankly, beginning in the 1980s, especially, to attempt to render India into an increasingly more homogeneous nation state. And that meant not the elimination of people, but what it meant was that everybody had to be cajoled, had to be coerced into thinking in a certain way. Right? And this is where the agenda of Hindu nationalism starts to become singularly important. Okay? Because, of course, India is, let's take the 1980s. You have the second most populous country in the world. Right? It's only become the most populous country in the world as of last year. The second most populous country in the world. Who ever paid any attention to India? No one did. There was a huge amount of anxiety in India that we're such a large country and we have virtually no presence anywhere on the international scene. The only time, and I can tell you that, I'm doing my PhD in the University of Chicago in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s, I joined UCLA as a professor. When do I see India mentioned in the newspapers? When I see India mentioned in the newspapers in a very big way when the Bhopal gas leak takes place, when Mrs. Gandhi is assassinated, right? It's incidents like that. It's one calamity after another, and that's when India comes into the consciousness. Otherwise, everybody's largely indifferent. Now, the elites in India began to think that we need to really make our presence felt. And this also is part of the story of the rise of Hindu nationalism, which almost no one tells, because the only story they're telling is how Hindu ideologues became important. Uh, and then, of course, you have to have a general idea of how religion starts to become important, not simply in India, but in many other countries of the world, including, of course, Pakistan, right? So this is really the broader picture of how we came to where we are today.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very that was a really great explanation. I'm glad you gave us the longer of two answers. To go more specifically into what you said about the elites in India during that time, feeling that we should kind of, and anyone who's paid attention to Indian politics, I don't think is any stranger to this idea that we're going to be a superpower and we're kind of competing with China and all of this kind of rhetoric. Was there anything economically that occurred? Was it perhaps the disillusion of the Nehruvian kind of non-aligned economy, so to speak? Was there anything that could be used to ground it in a historical materialist analysis?
Yes, of course. I mean that's often mentioned, right? I mean it's the neoliberalization, reforms. Okay, so I mean let's just take the year 1990 just as a benchmark. Okay, and you can also take 1950 as a benchmark. If you take 1950, what's the importance of 1950? Not the year itself, just taking that year 1950, 51. It doesn't matter. India and China were exactly on par. Exactly. Right? If you're looking at GDP, or their share of the contribution to the world economy, which was insignificant. Insignificant. Right? 1990, China has already gone considerably ahead of India. The reforms, as they're called, in uh, began in China circa 1980. In India, it is Manmohan Singh, Narasimha Rao. Those are the two people who are often credited with having jump-started the Indian economy. There are some dissenting views, by the way, on whether India's uh, uh, rate of growth is going to jump as much as some of the statistics suggest. There are statistics and there are statistics. There are all kinds of ways to interpret statistics. But so to go directly to your question, the Nehruvian dream had soured. Why? Because the pie never grew. It wasn't simply a matter of who gets what share of the pie. The pie never grew, right? That is the standard view of those who defend neoliberalization and the economic reforms which started in 1990, right? And it is certainly the case that there was a phrase that was used to describe the rate of growth uh, 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 in Nehruvian India. It was called the Hindu rate of growth, right? That basically actually the economic growth rate was basically the growth rate of uh, the Hindu population. So it was all done very mockingly that things are it's all increasing very, very slowly, very incrementally, and uh, no one is really being able to claim that India has made giant economic strides. Okay, so I think your question is invoking all of that. Now, of course, the question is, because I think implicit to in your question, even though you didn't put it that way, is there two things. One, is there a relationship between the rise of Hindu nationalism, okay, and what we might describe as those reforms? I think that's implicit in your question. And the second thing that's implicit in it is, how do we view that today, from the vantage point of today, going back to 1990 and then that decade of economic reforms? And the answer to both those questions, if I'm correct in reading your question, is very simply that yes, there is a relationship between the rise of Hindu nationalism and what we might describe as economic nationalism. Okay, that is that the same Hindu, the people who advocate for a muscular Hindu nation state and all of that, and the person who's presiding over that, the person presiding over that is the prime minister. And what does the prime minister do? What model did he put to the nation? He said the Gujarat model, right? Because Gujarat was put forward as a model state which had shown accelerated development. Accelerated development. Well, I was in Gujarat, by the way, earlier this year. I wouldn't say that I necessarily agree with that characterization of accelerated development. I see lots of wasted development, and I see huge swaths of areas which are absolute wasteland. But we won't get move in that direction necessarily. The important point was this also, that uh, this model of nationalism was also predicated, both Hindu nationalism and economic nationalism, predicated on the idea that we don't have to worry about such things as is individual liberties. Okay, this is a luxury, because in that sense, the model that India is really looking to, that the elites are looking to, is not the US, okay, or the advanced economies of the West. They're looking at countries such as Singapore. Why Singapore? Because it's an illustration of a country that has almost no natural resources of its own, and yet has a very high standard of living, uh, completely modern nation state, and completely authoritarian. Completely authoritarian. So there was always this feeling that Prime Minister Modi and the BJP party and the RSS people were able to bank upon. What is that feeling? They understood that Indians may not always say it clearly, but the Indian middle class had a hankering for this kind of authoritarianism, which meant that, look, let's not worry about individual liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. All of that is nonsense. It's a luxury. First, let's just accelerate our economic development. And you can see how this model is being put to use in India today. Unfortunately, there's very little to show in terms of real economic development, if you ask me. Yes, there's some infrastructural developments, I agree. Okay. But I just came back a month ago, and I mean, I'm looking at Gurgaon, and I'm driving down large uh, number of roads in Gurgaon, which is this huge satellite city, right? That is glittery and everything, and entire avenues, 2 kilometers long, that are just garbage dumps and nothing else. Just a few kilometers from where you have the shiny buildings. You know, so this idea that that uh, uh, these neo liberal reforms have helped to produce a real modern nation state, and that is with respect to development and all of that. This is to a considerable degree
Um,
illusory.
Professor Lal, sorry for cutting you off at the end there, but one thing I've always found interesting is that Hindutva really focuses itself on sort of like a mythology around the, or really narratives, I should say, around the Mughal Empire, right? Like they don't even only
Yeah.
look back at the British Raj, they also look back at the Mughal Empire and sort of view it as a point where like it led to India in its current situation, and we sort of have to correct it. How do you see this understanding of history shaping, modern day Indian politics? I'm so sorry for asking you such a broad question, but I just needed to know.
No, no, it's not a broad question at all. I mean, I mean, it goes to the heart of many of the things that I've written about in recently, and I mean, in some cases, going back to 25 years, I did a book called The History of History: Politics and Scholarship in Modern India, published by Oxford University Press in 2002. The question you're asking is a question I take up in that book. So it's only now it's only the people of the present generation who think that the question of the Mughals and what role they played in Indian history is really coming up for no the Hindu right has been animated by this question for a very long period of time, believe me. Okay, and in fact, and it's not an accident that people like Savarkar were working primarily, apart from being an ideologue, he was working primarily in the mode of a historian. So, to answer your question, we have to go to the question of history, okay, in the broadest sense, in a theoretical sense. You see, this idea that you can capture the past through something called history is an idea we have to be extremely wary of. And I'm saying that as someone who's teaching in a history department. Okay. So you
Right.
can imagine what some of my colleagues think of some of the things I say, because this is bread and butter for them. But you have to make a distinction between history and the past. The two are not the same. The question is, how do we access the past? Unfortunately, history has become the only way of accessing that past. In this way, India is fully emulating the West. Of
Mm.
course, there were traditions of historiography in India, but let it be noted very carefully, and this is an argument I've made very consistently, and I will not back down from that argument because I'm fully aware of how the past has been accessed in India and who did work of history and so on. The Muslim rulers had an interest in history, and the first historical works, practically speaking, in India come to us with the coming of Islam, fundamentally. No, anyone who thinks that the Mahabharata or a Ramayana is a work of history has no understanding of those works whatsoever. Which is not to say that you cannot read those works to try to gain some insight into how people were thinking at that time. Whenever those works were composed, and they weren't composed in a short period of time, the Mahabharata is composed over a period of 800 years. Okay, from roughly 400 BCE to 400 of the Common Era, 400 CE. History, okay, now then is a certain kind of discipline. Okay, and this discipline is a discipline that begins to be embraced in a very vigorous way by Indian nationalists in the 19th century, because what they understood is what nationalists have understood everywhere, that if we don't write our past, somebody else will do it for us, which is what the English were doing. And the Indian view, of course, was that, particularly as Indians became more astute about what the British were writing about India, that they're really misrepresenting our past, right? They're misrepresenting our history in particular. And so the writing of history starts to become critically important beginning in the late 19th century. And today it is the master discipline for all the Hindu nationalists. If there's one thing they want to do, ideologically speaking, what they want to do is they want to change the way in which we think about Indian history, about the Indian past, and how we interpret it. And that's one reason why they have been greatly animated by the Mughals, because the supposition on their part is that there's a kind of a consensus. The Hindu national view says that nationalist view says there's a kind of a consensus in the world, to the extent that people know anything about this, obviously, that the greatest period of the last several hundred years was the Mughal period. And who is the Mughal emperor who's always invoked as the preeminent example, let's say, of tolerance, right? I think you know the answer, right? Akbar. Okay.
Mm.
And then of course, if you look, for example, and here again, we will not get into the specifics of whether all economic historians agree with this finding or not. But there's a Cambridge economist. His name is Angus Madison, and 2 decades ago he came up with this data, which was just absolutely astounding to lots of people. I think today is part of the common sense of what people understand what happened at that time, frankly. And what was the data he came up with? That if you look at let's say India, circa the world, if you look at the world circa 1700 to 1800, what are the three largest economies of the world at that time? China, India, and Europe put together. And the three, among the three of them, you have accounted for virtually 95% of the world's GDP. And that India accounted for 25% of the world's GDP moving into the 1700s. Right? Now, the point is this, that you might think to yourself that the present government should take the view that, look, the real the real guilt here uh, should be associated with the British, because what is it that happened to India under colonial rule? That India became a land of deep and depressing immiseration, i.e., poverty. A country that was accounted for 25% of the world's GDP at the height of the Mughal Empire, even under Aurangzeb, okay, in the 1700s. Akbar is, of course, earlier, right? In the 1700s, well, Aurangzeb dies in 1707, but so we're talking about the late 1600s and then moving into the 1700s, into the period of his successors before the disintegration of the Mughal Empire begins and the British begin to establish their presence. This was a commanding world economy. And not only a commanding world economy, the Mughal Empire was an extraordinarily important player on the what we can retrospectively call the global intellectual cultural scene. Nobody thought of it that way, okay, in the way in which we think of world culture today. All right. But I'm saying that it was an extraordinarily important player in many ways. Now, under the British, India becomes severely deindustrialized. And I tell you that the period 1875 to 1925 is a period of such catastrophic death that I think almost all Indians, barring those who have really read deeply into that period, have no awareness of what happened. And that in those 50 years, there were 100 million excess deaths. 100 million. And you can track it, by the way, from census data, among other things. And what's causing these 100 million excess deaths? Okay, plagues, epidemics, cholera, measles, hunger, famine. And who is responsible for a large portion of that, including famine? British policies in India, right? So this entire emphasis on the Mughals that you're now finding, where the Mughals are being sort of being beaten into submission retrospectively, as it were, okay, where the Mughals are being branded as a real enemy, taking Aurangzeb, who is viewed as someone who had huge animus against the Hindus and the Sikhs. This is, in fact, such an extraordinary distortion, okay, that is taking the whole Mughal period. It's a distortion that fully serves the purpose of Hindu nationalists, because there is no question in my mind that Hindu nationalism has a fundamental problem with the Muslim presence in India. I think we need to state it as bluntly as that. You know, all right? And that is really, I mean, we can discuss many other aspects of the history of the Mughals. And again, I want to be very clear. I want to be very clear uh, that when you're looking at somebody like Aurangzeb, I'm not putting him forward as an example of tolerance necessarily, but there's very deep scholarly work done to look at his period, the period that he was presiding over, which is a period that extends to well over 40 years as emperor. Okay, uh, His reign is as long as the reign of Akbar. Um, if you look at that period, there is no question that there were some policies that were pursued, which were certainly detrimental to the Hindu population and to the Sikh population. The imposition of jizya, which is a poll tax, okay, a head tax, which was to which non-Muslims were subjected. But you should note, by the way, that there are lots of exceptions that are also carved out in the jizya. So women who are pregnant, elderly people, for example, people who are blind, people who are disabled, none of them, even if they're not Muslims, don't have to pay. None of them have to pay the jizya. I mean, so we can get into the particulars of what really happened even under Aurangzeb, but in any case, the question is Aurangzeb is only one of many Mughal emperors, right? If you have to take the period in totality, it's a period which is enormously rich in many respects. That's, if you had to come to a brief conclusion, that's a conclusion you'd come to after a study of that period, right? So I think we have to understand what is it that what is the animus that drives Hindu nationalism, okay, and that will tell us a lot about how they reconstruct the past, how they deploy history, okay, how they instrumentalize it, right? And here again, let me also add this caveat. If you read my history of history, I'm very clear in that book, in my book, that this is not the first time when I was writing it. So this is long before Mr. Modi and the present government came into power. Okay, the book is published in 2002, the history of history. But these disputes, which you see as disputes over the content of history textbooks. So both of you may be aware that over the course of the last 2 3 years, there's been a serious attempt to tamper with the content of history textbooks, school textbooks. But as I make it very clear, this has a very long history. There were Congress governments that were involved in this too. It should be noted very clearly, okay? But certainly not on the scale on which they have been doing that, okay, in India since 2014. And I think one analogy you can think of is what's happening in modern day Trump's America, okay, where there is a complete evisceration, okay, of certain kinds of histories taking place. Over 1,000 books have been removed from libraries, for example. I mean, what we're talking about in the U.S. today is the sort of thing that the Indian government has been doing in different ways, particularly since 2014. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I find it very fascinating that they focus on the Mughals rather than the British. And of course, some of this rewriting is kind of new. I mean, in 2021, the Indian government removed Mughal Empire, one of the greatest, from their website. So even up till very recently, the Mughal Empire was being recognized as like a very great, almost golden point in Indian history. And then, of course, this trend has been around for a long time, but it's been slowly but surely sort of becoming like a very big catalyst for all these movements, all this anger. But why isn't it directed at the British? Why the Mughals? Is it because India has such a large Muslim population and it's easy to sort of connect these two, even though that's like a very ahistorical, or is it something else?
Well, I mean, the first consideration here, and the most self-evident one in some ways, with regards to the question of why this animus. Your question is, why is this animus being directed against the Mughals and not against the British? The first answer to that is the British are the past. That past is dead, so to speak. They're no longer in India. They're no longer a part of the Indian landscape. Now the Muslims are part of the Indian landscape.
Mm-hmm.
They persist. And of course, there's this fantasy that, oh, their numbers are growing astronomically. You know, now another Pakistan is going, might emerge. There's going to be a demand for, another partition of India 30 years from now, etc., etc. I mean, that's the most evident answer to your question. The past, if I may echo a number of people from the several centuries, the past is dead.
Mm.
The Muslims are not the past of India only. They are the future of India. They're not only the present of India, they are the future of India too, as they should be. Okay? I think that that is the first thing that we have to take note of. Now now we can get, once we've established that much, we can get into many other things. Look, if you think about, okay, the cultural stratosphere, all right, see, what did the British bequeath to us that has endured in our country? Is there anything in their food?
No.
Nothing. Zero.
No.
Thank God.
Zero. In fact, if anything, we bequeath everything decent they have in their food today.
I mean,
The only
biscuits, maybe.
well, yeah, maybe tea biscuits, and you
Yeah.
could say, but you see what I mean is I'm talking about cuisines, right?
Oh,
I'm
yeah,
not
yeah.
talking about something you nibble on, in the morning. Maybe parley biscuits, although I don't know if parley biscuits were. It's an interesting story of how far they go back and all of that. But you get the general sense of what I mean. That that nobody in India eats steak and kidney pie. Okay, right? You don't eat Yorkshire pudding in India, right? There's nothing there, nothing whatsoever. Okay, so what is it that remained? It's first, it's the language in which we're conversing right now. It's the English language. Okay, and then of course in the political domain you can speak of parliamentary institutions and all of that. To what degree they have some similarity with English parliamentary institutions is a question that we is never asked, by the way. It's just taken for granted, but we won't get into that. I'm saying in the totality of things, there's really very little, frankly. In the case of the Muslims of India, we're talking about an entirely different story. We're saying that that cuisine has has become entirely absorbed into the cuisines in the plural of India, because there was Muslim presence, as you know, and continues to be Muslim presence in all parts of India.
Mm.
Okay, so you can even think of the various ways in which Muslim cuisine has influenced even places like Gujarat. By the way, because of the fact that Western India there was Muslim traders coming in from the Arab world. Obviously, Kerala. I'm not even speaking about the most obvious places, which is all of Northwest India, Punjab, you know, Kashmir, etc., etc. I'm not even thinking about all of that. That's just too obvious. You think about the music, Hindustani music. I mean, there are two. So there's Hindustani music and there's Carnatic music. Hindustani music, the Gharanas are full of Muslims and Hindus. You see, they are an inextricable part. Now that of who we are. In fact, I have argued radically. I know that that I can be subjected to severe admonishment and worse from both sides. I want to say something to you right now and say it openly, and we can spend the next 6 hours and the next 6 weeks unraveling that in all of its complexities. And that proposition is simply this: you cannot really be a Hindu in India without recognizing the Muslim in yourself to some degree.
Mm.
And you cannot be a Muslim in India without recognizing something of the Hindu in yourself. In North India, it is, people say it's just a cliched expression. I think it has to be taken very seriously when people speak about the Ganga Yamuna Tehzeeb, the culture that developed in the Doab, right, in the area between Doab, between the two rivers and the Gangetic Plains. right? This was an integral part of who we became as a people. And you'll see where I'm leading to in just a moment, and then I'll conclude my long comment here, right? But before I get to that, one little thing. So, for example, there's a contemporary Indian writer. He's written a book. His name is Saeed Naqvi, and the book it's really like a play in a way. Um, it's called "The Muslim Vanishes," where the whole and I've done a book talk on that, which is on my YouTube channel. And so it's like, it begins with these journalists, uh, meet, meeting in the morning, and suddenly one of them says, "It looks like, my God, I mean, all the Muslim monuments have disappeared. I don't see the Taj anymore. I don't see the Qutb anymore." And then essentially the film construes this imaginary scenario where the Muslim disappears from India altogether. Okay, and what would that mean? You know, how would we even begin to comprehend that? Because look, what is it that some leading people in the government, I won't mention names, what leading people in the government occupying again the highest offices of the land have said? Sometimes they've said it almost not exactly in those words. They want a country that is free of Muslims, Musalman Mukt, free of Muslims, in a manner of speaking, right? And this is what really prompted, in a sense, Saeed Naqvi to write this kind of anguished and yet satirical play, The Muslim Vanishes, right? So, to go back to your question, the Muslim is within us, which is why he generates a different kind of anxiety. The Britishers are not within us. Forget about their being with us. They're not, because we got our independence in 1947, and the British didn't stay behind. India was not a settler colony. This is not South Africa. Even in the case of South Africa, a large number of whites left, huge number of people stayed. Algeria was a settler colony. 90% of the French who were there left Algeria once Algeria became free and it was a civil war, but 10% stayed behind. Okay? Who stayed behind among the British? Hardly anyone. A few scattered individuals here and there, frankly. Okay? And that's what I mean. That past is dead. I'm arguing from the standpoint of Hindutva. This is how but for them, the Muslim is very much present, threateningly present in every way, in every domain of Indian life. Okay? And this always generates an enormous anxiety. It's like what Freud had mentioned when he wrote about what he called the narcissism of minor differences, that sometimes our hatred is most acutely felt towards those who are very much like us. Okay? The English football fans belonging to Liverpool, Arsenal, Manchester City, etc. They all come from the same milieu, and yet they hate each other with a passion which is incredible. You know, that animosity is much greater than the animosity that any of them might have for a Frenchman or a Frenchwoman or a German or whoever. That's what Freud was trying to understand. So he says that sometimes we feel the most hatred, the most animosity is generated against those who are very close to us. And this is what I'm trying to underscore. What the proximity in that sense, in every way, of the Hindu to the Muslim, in that part of the world. And what is important is this, that the British were trying to do exactly the opposite, which is what partly led to the two nation theory. Okay, because what was the British formula? I always tell my students that, and some of them think it's a little too formulaic, but it's actually from the colonial texts. And what is that? It's straight from the colonial texts, where British officials say, hey, we'll tell you how different the Hindus and Muslims are. There's no better way to describe their difference and the fact that they're two separate nations, then to understand that the Muslim loves to eat the cow and the Hindu loves to worship the cow. And the British would say, can there be anything more different than that? You see, right? So you see what I'm driving at, Manpreet.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Can I say, I was just reading this yesterday, so it just wanted to make a quick comment on this, but because you mentioned Freud and his focus on that, you know, Lacan, who, you know, in his interpretation of Freud, he really talked about how, you know, we learned that the Earth is not the center of the universe, and then, you know, and then eventually Freud came along and showed us that we are not the center of ourselves, you know, and that Hegel and Kant, all these people who think we are observer at the center of ourselves, are wrong. And Lacan argued that, well, this is actually something we are threatened by. We seek to ignore. We're, you know, irritated by it, and so it makes sense, you know, that in the process of nationalism and national identity formation, the delineations, you know, between the nation and not the nation are drawn, you know, closely, you know, to
Yes.
kind of remind you that this is the center. You know, this is not part of some complex, you know, interaction. You know,
Yeah.
you know, and I'm not part of some. I'm not an arbitrary part of some space. I am the space, and it's an interesting, a very interesting insight. I think you mentioned.
It also simplifies so much. I mean, there was so much cross connection between the Arab world and India and all this cross trade, and sort of in the modern day, it just becomes so simplified, and it's like us versus them, and everything was sort of in a vacuum, and yada yada, and it's
Yeah.
projecting the present onto very past complex systems that don't really conform neatly to the nation state or nationalism.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, like in reading Integral Humanism, something that really struck me is the view that, you know, and it's kind of like, you know, it's sort of a very different, but there are some similarities to this book, A Dying Colonialism by Frantz Fanon,
Yes. Yeah.
where he identifies how the Algerian people used their traditions that were deemed, you know, inferior, deemed, you know, out of the past, of the indigenous, essentially, to launch a successful revolt against French colonial rule. And in Integral Humanism, there's almost a sense that he's trying to do this, where he's saying, well, before this whole idea of a nation state and a nation, we were a nation, and we did live here, and we were on this, you know, space, and we had this thing, and, you know, the Muslim came and the British came and polluted this, you know,
Yes.
we need to kind of, you know, kind of classic, you know, right wing, you know, sort of fascist stuff. But it's interesting too, because it's sort of, you know, it's almost like peeling back the layers, like, well, the British went and left, now we have to go back, you know, what was there before, and we need to get rid of that, and then,
Yeah.
you know, maybe then the Persians, or, you know, and kind of get rid of everything going backwards.
Yes. Well, I mean, you know, look, I'll just offer a very short comment here, but I mean, there's one problem that I think one encounters everywhere. I mean, you see that in the U.S., but you also see it, you know, in the countries of the Caribbean, where I've been to in connection with my, you know, interests, political interests, interest in colonialism, and my interest in the Indian diaspora. So I'm thinking, you know, thinking of countries such as Trinidad, for example, and Guyana. Um, and what is it that I'm referring to here when I'm referring to the Caribbean? I said you see it in the U.S. preeminently. In some ways, you're seeing it in India, of course. And that is this whole question of priority of arrival, as I call it, right? Well, we were here before you were. Well, the first thing is, what does this mean? Okay. I mean, in some ways, it's frankly primitive, if you ask me, a primitive way of even thinking about any question. And in the US, of course, it's the height of absurdity to adopt that view. But frankly, what has MAGA done? That's what it's done. It's essentially adopted that, you know. So when it's trying to boot out all these immigrants, albeit they'll say illegal ones, you know, although no one doubts that they have their mind on lots of legal ones too. But if and they may get around to them later on. Um, but this idea that, well, look, essentially, what are the most characteristic features of this nation? What is the MAGA hypothesis? The most characteristic features are that this is an Anglo-Christian country. And why is it an Anglo-Christian country? Because it has to do with the priority of arrival. Who are the people who first came here? They're the Puritans and the Pilgrims. So these are people who come from England, okay, and England and the British Isles more broadly. The Irish actually only come as indentured servants in the first phases. They come, of course, in other capacity in the 19th century. Okay, but it's the English, it's the Scots. And then after that, you're going to get more white people. You're going to get people coming from Scandinavia and Germany, etc. Right? So that's this is, what is it? It's priority of arrival. That the Chinese and the Japanese and and South Asians like myself and all the others, they all came much later. You know, and incidentally, that argument is used in Trinidad by the Afro population, as it is in Guyana. And why is that an argument that is equally egregious and specious in that part of the world? Because the Africans were brought in there as slave labor, and Indians were brought in there as indentured labor, which, indenture may be another form of slavery. Whether it is or not is a question that need not detain us. The point is that both of them are brought there. Okay, neither of them is indigenous to that part of the world, because the indigenous population was largely wiped out. Yes, there were a few Caribs left, okay, but the indigenous population was wiped out. But I'm always amazed to the extent to which I would often hear this argument, especially from the Afro Trinidadians and the Afro Guyanese, say, well, we were here before the Indians were here, right? And of course, I mean, in some ways, you can tie this to the Manpreet's question, although I didn't really, uh, you know, give this particular answer, because I think in India that it doesn't really work that way, which is that the effect here was to give the white man a free ride in Guyana and in Trinidad. They're let off the hook, because now the real dispute, the real interracial struggle, is between the Afro Trinidadians and the Indo Trinidadians. And in Guyana, it's between the Afro Guyanese and the Indo Guyanese. These are the two dominant populations. And of course, you could say in India, that's what the ruling dispensation has done. By picking on the Muslims and the Mughal Empire, etc., they've given British rule a free ride, the white man a free ride, right? But I think, as I said, there are many angles through which one can begin to examine this. We can take a much larger philosophical conception here, which would take us back to Lacan and people like that, and that conception would have to do with how we begin to think about the self, and how is it that people become strangers to one's self. Okay, right? And what we have to do, if I may use this phrase, what we have to do to host their otherness within us, right? We have to start thinking about that. I think in every country of the world, we would have to start thinking about that. And if you had to use a different language, we would have to start thinking about what are the kinds of languages of hospitality that we've lost. You see, even using word such as hospitality today is difficult. Why? Because it's been completely hijacked by the hospitality industry. Uh, okay, and which is all about marketing and bullshit, as far as I'm concerned. You know, right? I'm talking about what it means to be hospitable to the other. And then it means that you have to be hospitable to their otherness. And you have to be able to host that otherness within yourself, which is very demanding and very challenging, ethically, philosophically, practically. You see?
Yeah, it's funny that so many world religions really have that as a pretty or in some form, that demand in them, and it's still so hard for people. And I guess I have just for a last question. I think it's a bit broad, so I'd like to delay it just a second and talk about this a little bit more. But in just to tie it up a little bit, I guess in a more, if there is any Marxist reading in terms of that, the Nehruvian economy sort of dissolving and the neoliberalization. Of course, lots of historical materialists, look at events like that and the political ramifications as being tied to social relations, to the ownership of land, and so on. Of course, given that India is geographically complex and that different regions have very different economic characteristics and so on, so it's hard to tie it up neatly in a bow, and historical materialism is generally limiting. But if there's anything there in terms of kind of capitalist interests, in terms of landed interests, that made this very appealing to a certain section of elite, because Hindutva really does feel, despite its populist appeal, as a bit of a revolution from the top. Even back in the beginning, from what I've heard and from what we've discussed here.
Yeah, I mean, look, let's consider a couple of aspects of the story. So one aspect of the story has to do with, and that will actually bring in the Maoists into the picture, okay? The whole question of Maoism, or Naxalism, as we call it in India. And for the benefit of your listeners, it might be important to just underscore what Naxalism is, but the term goes back to Naxalbari, which is a place in West Bengal where a Bengali ideologue and intellectual by the name of Charu Mazumdar, sort of using the vanguard theory, right? So, you need intellectuals as a vanguard, initiates a movement which is really against, you could say, landlordism, among other things. It's against the inequities of capitalism, of course, broadly speaking, but it has to do with the depredations of the landlords and the grievance experienced by peasants at the inability to be able to have serious land reform. Okay, so this movement commences, and Charu Mazumdar and people like that are inspired by Mao. I think one of the documents I teach, I just taught it a couple of weeks ago, is this fabulous document. When I say fabulous, I don't mean as a term of approbation necessarily in terms of my agreement with the arguments, but it's a fabulous read, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, which is Mao's report on the conditions of the peasantry in Hunan province, 1927, where he personally, went around Hunan province for several months and writes this absolutely amazing document. And the Maoists were far more important for people like Charu Mazumdar than Marx was, partly because Marx didn't really pay much attention, if any, to the rural peasantry. In fact, the idiocy of the countryside is what he often talked about. And the urban proletariat was, the subject of much of his research and ruminations. That's not the case, of course, with Mao. But now going back then to the Maoists or the Naxalites. So this Naxalite movement has been around in many parts of India. At sometimes it has seemed to encompass the entire tribal belts of India, large chunks of what used to be the state of Andhra Pradesh and now is two separate states. Uh, uh, but substantial portions of Chhattisgarh, Odisha, many other parts. It's sometimes called the Red Corridor. the former Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh. I think sometime in 2009, I'm almost certain it was 2009 because I remember it was what struck me was this comment that he made, which I'm going to cite, was a year after the 2008 terrorist attacks, as they're called, upon a number of sites, most famously the Taj Hotel in Bombay, in and around Bombay. And in 2009, what did Manmohan Singh say? That he said that the Naxalism was the greatest threat to the security of India. Okay, right? Now, what is this about? And this goes back really to your question. What it's really about is, um, you can say two or three different things, which is that if you really look, okay, at the history of post-independent India, um, I think there has been a uh, uh, unquestionable failure in being able to effect uh, substantive land reform. Okay. Now, one state where it did happen, but that history is a lot more complex than the communists would like to admit, although they know that history, but they won't openly admit it. Okay. So, Kerala is that one state where there was very substantive land reform with literally a stroke of the pen, so to speak, almost, is the state of Kerala, southwest India. And that state has a singular distinction along with West Bengal at that time, being the only state that was under communist rule. And in fact, Kerala is often described as the first place in the world where the communists were legally elected to power and will continue to be for decades. What the communists don't tell you, and all of this has a bearing on what we're talking about neoliberalization, economic reforms, and this and that, because there was also the Kerala model. So Modi put forward the Gujarat model. Long before that, the UN had actually put forward the Kerala model, as it was called. Amartya Sen, widely known, of course, around the world as a development economist who won the Nobel Prize in economics, was among many others who wrote on the Kerala model. And what was the Kerala model? That here you had a state in India which, unlike the rest of India, and this is what you were alluding to, that it's very difficult to speak of India in the singular in that sense because the regional differences are so sharp. Uh, okay, and the Kerala was an exception to the rest of India because it had 98 percent literacy rate. They had effected land reform, so that practically every family owned some land. The maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates were far lower than they were in other parts of India. And you can contrast the difference with, let's say, some districts in Rajasthan. I'm taking some of the states that are the most wretched state that is their position. Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh. Okay, there are some districts there where female literacy even today is 10%. 10% female literacy in some districts, and then you have Kerala where the literacy rate, as I said, across the board, 95, 98, 99. Okay, so that was the Kerala model. But what is it that the communists don't tell you? Because the communists put forward the impression that the Kerala model all had to do with the reforms that they'd implemented. False, to put it bluntly. Why? Because we have to understand how Kerala became the state of Kerala. It is put together by adding three princely states, two of which, Cochin and Travancore, were already, by the late 19th century, long before the communists came to power, already very progressive states in comparison with other princely states around India. Much higher literacy rates. We'd have to go to the history of those princely states to understand how Kerala became the state that would then be sold to the rest of the world as a model state. Now, I'm not saying that the communists didn't have some role to play in some things. I'm not saying that, but I think it's completely misleading to suppose that it was really the communists who were preeminently responsible for how Kerala eventually turned out and how it shaped up. Okay, that's one part of the story. The other part of the story, which takes us back to the tribals, is the story of resource extraction. But neoliberalization also means that companies and this is where the Hindu nation state model has worked hand in hand with the wealthiest people in India. Okay, when people talk about the nexus between the Ambanis and the Adanis, particularly, and the Modi regime, this is not one of these casual. Yes, people throw it around casually without knowing the details, as we all do. We all casually throw around remarks about which we know very little. But the point is that there is some substance there, and that has to do with trying to understand how the wealthiest individuals and the richest companies in India, okay, have been aided in the task of resource extraction. That means infiltration of tribal areas. A lot of, as is the case in Myanmar, many other countries, okay, the mineral wealth is disproportionately in areas which are now under tribal jurisdiction, so to speak. They're part of tribal India. And of course, the government of India has a policy in principle that these tribal areas should be left largely untouched, that there should be development, should be encouraged, but it should be development that is sustainable, commensurate with the cultures of these peoples, etc., etc. In extreme cases, they've even, as is the case on the Andamans, of course, that's a very extreme case. Technically, no one is supposed to have contact with these people whatsoever. Okay, right? But if you take the more general model, the point is that these are the areas where resource extraction is critically important in the kind of rampant, rapacious capitalism, which is integrally a part of the politics of the Indian nation state today. And that is one reason why they are adamant upon this, upon waging war upon the Naxalites, because the Naxalites have disproportionate influence in some of these tribal areas. You see, right? So there is everybody knows about the war with Pakistan. Almost no one knows about the war that the Indian state is waging against tribal populations effectively. They say that they're waging them only against the Maoists, and an operation is underway as we're speaking right now. Even reported a few days ago in a small article in the New York Times about the Indian state and the fact that in this long-standing war against Maoism, this year in particular, they're making strident attempts to remove them because the Amit Shah, the Home Minister has declared that he wants India free of Maoism by March of 2026. Right? Okay, so free of the Muslims, free of the Maoists, right? Free of the secularists, free of the liberals. Who's going to remain, right? That remains to be seen.
Yeah, it is an interesting sort of right-wing mentality where you create a goal and then you think, well, we have the right goal, so we'll figure out how we achieve it. Whereas I suppose in general, the left very broadly is more in terms of analysis and then understanding how things play out. Maybe that's too much of a judgment, but it is curious when people kind of have that attitude. They have the goal and then the solution they anticipate will work out later.
Yeah, but you see, you're making the comparison with the fact that the left may have a more amenable to us, for example. But I would say the real contrast here is with Mohandas Gandhi, because in principle the Indian state still recognizes him as the father of the nation on October 2nd. for example, on his birthday, the prime minister dutifully goes to Rajghat, lays a wreath of flowers, and then again on January 30th. But where is even the slightest adherence to Gandhi? Because, and how does Gandhi come into the picture here? Because his entire life, and I'm saying this apropos of what you said, his entire life he worked on the question of the relationship of means to ends. And what did Gandhi say there? Be attentive to the means only. What the Indian government, the ends will come, so to speak, when the means are correct. Be attentive to the means. The Indian government thinks exactly the opposite. As you said, you set the goal. Goal is eliminate Maoism. Whether you do it by the carrot, whether you do it by the AK-47 or by cluster bombs, who cares?
Yeah, and no, there's no thought about what the ramifications will be, or what, I suppose it's part of a general fascist mentality, and also this kind of particular breed of populist nationalism, the kind of Orban, Trump, BJP kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's certainly, I think that would warrant quite a long discussion of its own. I did want to get into this last topic, which is no small. It's not small, but it's just a quote from Nehru that made me think a little bit, and want to connect what the quote reminded me of to a broader discussion about post-colonial theory and universalization. And the quote was just from Nehru, actually. So it must be remembered that the people of the Kashmir Valley and roundabout, though highly gifted in many ways in intelligence and artisanship, etc., are not what are called virile people. And it reminded me, and there's a few other quotes like this as well, and it's only fair to an extent, but it initially reminded me of Robert Orme, actually, and a lot of the attitude towards Kashmiris as this effeminacy,
Yeah.
So I wasn't so much interested in talking about that specifically in the attitude, whether it's colonial discourse about Kashmir, but rather to say, is there something useful, or even just read his book, Vijay Prashad, his book, pretty good book I just read recently about the Arab Spring. He himself said in an interview, I think a week ago, that, well, if there's an independent Kashmir, who's going to develop it for them? Who's going to, and this attitude is very prevalent. And obviously universalization does have problems, but do you think that to some degree it is necessary, that to some degree it is a worthwhile pursuit despite the hazards, because it can also be used to obfuscate and avoid analyses? For example, I think a lot about Western Sahara, where a lot of Moroccan nationalists discuss this as this is a inter-Nicene kind of personal thing. This has nothing to do with colonization. That's totally different. Why would you ever have that framework? Zionists sometimes do this as well too, but less so, because the connection to Europe is quite strong in the case of Israel. But do you think that does that raise any clear jumping off points for you in terms of that discussion? Obviously, there's some context with the Vivek Chibber from NYU and Godfrey Spivak had a whole dispute basically between Marxism and post-colonial theory on this sort of subject, that post-colonial theory recreates the essentially different homogenous East in the same way Orientalism did, and you can't have these universal frameworks. Anything there?
Well, I think we will, to be quite frank, I think we're going to need a separate discussion on this, because that I know the Chibber debate. It's not so much, by the way, with Spivak. The book that he did, the main targets there is not Spivak. The main target is Partho Chatterjee and Dipesh Chakrabarti, actually. So I think that's I mean, he inspired, of course, with many, and I think the general view is that Partho came out on top of that, because Partho and Chipper have, there's actually video recordings of their debates as well. It's not necessary for me to enter into how I think about that, because as I said, that's a very long subject. I think you'll agree, because we'd have to get into their respective positions, and then also then try to attempt to understand um, to what extent their positions are representative of both post-colonial positions. Post-coloniality has had its day, if you ask me, right? I mean, we're talking about a very different time than, let's say, 3 decades ago. Um, so that's one set of questions. But when I say this is all a subject for another discussion, because you started with a quote from Nehru on Kashmir, and I think we should have a separate discussion, perhaps not maybe some months from now, on Kashmir. It doesn't have to be always around the time when there's a war going on. People, usually have discussions when it's prompted by a war or an event or something like that. But Kashmir is there. The problem is there. It's been there, for decades, obviously. And I'll say this much, just so that I give you a little trigger point to think about that quotation from Nehru, where he says that, look, the Kashmiris are gifted people and all of that, but they're not particularly virile. And you said it reminded you of Robert Orme. Uh, so we know that Orme, of course, wrote the classic essay, one of the classic essays, which I have written about, by the way, at considerable length in a number of places. That essay dates back to the 1780s, on the effeminacy of the inhabitants of Hindustan. Um, Now, the what I want to say is this: I think we'll have to, and I think it requires actually a discussion where I think we should begin with about Nehru's whole relationship to Kashmir. It's always mentioned in passing here and there, and he himself uh, in his autobiography has an early chapter where he talks about his Kashmiri ancestry. Okay, um, and I think that we're going to have to place that remark first within that context. Okay, you've taken it to a very different plane by putting it within a larger argument about post-colonial thought versus, let's say, a more Marxist kind of view rooted in historical materialism in whatever shape or form. Okay.
or at least like more universalizing, I
Yeah,
suppose, in a
yeah,
way that would be against
yeah.
post-colonial
So I
thought.
will. So I will go to that universalizing in a different way. That's the only comment I want to make, and I think
Mm.
we'll stop here.
Yeah,
He's writing all of this in the 1930s, early 1940s. I don't know exactly where that quote comes from. It's not from his autobiography, that I know, and I don't think it's from the discovery of India either. It may be from a letter he wrote to Indra in the Glimpses of World History, but I doubt that too. But wherever it comes from, he's writing basically all of this kind of thing in the 30s, early 40s. What is happening there? This is intensely a time of what is called the national character industry. Okay, that is that uh, there was a whole school of thought which dwelled on national character and ascribed a national character to every people. So this is the national character of the Germans. They are militaristic. They have always got their boots on the ground. You know,
yeah.
okay. For them there is a fatherland as there is for the Russians, but for everyone else there's a motherland. Okay,
Mhm.
this is the national character of the Gallic people. The French people, the English people. This is what's called the national character industry. The United States government, in fact, actually commissioned a huge number of studies on the national character of every people. Now, I'm not saying that Nehru is part of that study. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's a certain ethos at that time where where Nehru, in a sense, has fallen into that, where he's ascribing. Because on what basis does a person say so and so are not a virile people? Of course, that's also first uh, putting a term of approbation to virile, because virile can be read purely neutrally. I don't think it's not usually neutral. If a woman said of a man in front of her husband, he's a virile character, okay, that is a different meaning, the word virile, than when Nehru says the Kashmiris are not a virile people, okay. That is to say that the semiotic range there of that word virile, of course, it suggests someone who's got some masculinity, who's got some guts, who's manly, okay. And what I'm saying is that partly we have to understand that that's the language of that time. Now you can do a more, we would move to the next layer before we even get to historical materialism, this and that, post-colonial theory, and then that next layer, if we of interpretation, would have to do with its assessment of the history of Kashmir. Okay, because what is it that made the Kashmiris not particularly virile? It could be that Nehru himself thought that by and large, Kashmir had actually been spared. The kind of, if I may put it this way, the kind of constant uh, din of activity, military activity, that had characterized the Punjab in particular. Don't forget also that Kashmir, when he's writing, is under the rule of a Hindu Maharaja. Okay, what effect the Hindu Maharaja had upon his population, upon his subjects, that could be part of the story for Nehru. So you see what I mean, right? I think we would have to begin to unpack many layers in order to get a sense of, and I'd have to know where this quote is coming from. What's the larger, you know, uh, context within which it's located? In order for me, is it part of a letter he writes? It's part of an essay he writes. It's an assessment that he offers to someone. I think that all of that would have to be part of the discussion.
Yeah, I just to be, it should be in the citations of her book, but it is just at the beginning in the introduction of colonizing Kashmir, and her view is, that so she brings it up as an example of a uh,
Colonial mindset.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
exactly.
yeah. No, no,
But
no.
I
I
guess,
know.
but
I
I really appreciate all of those considerations at any rate, though, and I think it was more the spirit of the comparison. To what degree does saying that, well, that's,
yeah,
an unfair comparison because this is some, that's not at all what you're saying, but this is unfair because it's somehow internal, or it's part of this kind of um, nation state politics
yeah,
internally. When is the framework of colonization uh,
yes,
appropriate? And because in some cases, I don't think many people would contest the case of West Papua, for instance, or a play where these are not European nations, but it's very clearly that framework is applicable, for all kinds of
yes,
reasons.
yeah.
And so I guess as a general subject, where do you feel in insofar as or as a
About the question of the colonization of Kashmir.
no, I actually was speaking more generally, just about when should, and especially in the West, when should, or it's not a clear line, but what are some of the um, areas where, as she may, because she explicitly says that, well, in the case of Kashmir, this is comparable to colonization just
Yeah,
as much as
yeah,
anything else.
yeah,
Are there obviously there are hazards in there because of because of various circumstances, and also then you can kind of look at all kinds of, you could look at say the experience of the Basque region under Franco, and it's not really colonization. It's kind of
Yeah.
really very different. So where does this become? Where
Yeah.
should frameworks like that be applied across the board, and where should we really think in terms of world systems theory and the global south, global
No,
north?
but that's what I meant. I think that we're going to have a separate
Yeah.
conversation on that. That's too large a subject, because we'd have to look at, I mean, I know Hafsa's position. As I said, she gave a talk at UCLA, and I, was a discussant for that, and I know that she's also among those, and as there are many others who draw analogies between Palestine and Kashmir, and many in the movement have drawn these analogies. I think sometimes these are drawn much too quickly and easily, um, um, and I also do think, but I don't really want to, because as I said, it's really subject for a long discussion. But just on the question of Kashmir,
Mhm.
one last point. I think what's also I think something that has both surprised me and distressed me a little bit at times is that people whose views I might generally agree with otherwise, in general, what the extent to which they don't want to really look at, for example, the long history of Kashmir. Okay, by that, let me be very clear. I'm not talking about the presence of just Kashmiri Pandits and all of that, because on the Hindu side they always say that, let's imagine that everything that's been said about Kashmir is right, but why is no one talking about the Kashmiri Pandits? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm talking about is the fact that the substratum of that civilization was Shaivism, and there's a very long history of Kashmiri Shaivism, a history that goes back to at least 1,000, 1,500 years. I don't see contemporary political discussions really taking that into account at all. And why they don't is something that I think needs to be asked as well. You see, okay. So that's why I said this is subject for another discussion, because then especially if we start locating it in relationship to other illustrations of, um, you know, internal colonization, for example. Um, because let's supposing someone said, well, apart from the fact that Kashmir is disputed between two nation states, um, possibly three if you brought in China and some of its claims here or there, but let's say India and Pakistan. Uh, Apart from that fact, uh, how does the position in Kashmir differ? For example, if you're looking at internal colonization, okay, then Baluchistan, which is within Pakistan, where there is a whole liberation movement. How is it different? Uh, why is it that the people who speak about Kashmir uh, do not draw any analogies with that, although Baluchistan is part of Pakistan? Okay, uh,
Mhm.
right? Yeah, just as an illustration.
Yeah, so maybe
So,
to very
yeah, there are too many different angles that we can think about here. Yeah,
and maybe to very crudely put a caricature on what you're saying, there's some gradient between re-territorialization and nation state formation
yeah,
and colonization, and there are things that exist in between there, in that space, that are not so easily categorized. And I got very interested in and engaged in, actually, especially, I mean, in online discourse, in Ethiopian politics. And it's a very interesting country, because you see um, many different groups that have very, very legitimate and real
yeah,
and grievances and living memory.
yeah,
And there are dominant groups and the groups that have run the government for a good amount of time. But in general, everyone has basically suffered a lot and
yeah,
dished it out to others as well. And it's not so much a clear case of, it's actually something one of the only things I felt a little bit equipped to sort of take some umbrage with in Hafsa's book, because she mentions the Oromo as a group that were kind of unfairly
yeah, yeah,
included, and the Tigrayans unfairly included in Ethiopian. So, well, his
yeah,
picture is quite complex. So I definitely understand,
Oh,
that.
yeah. The picture there is actually very complex. I mean, I've been to Ethiopia. In fact, actually, I commissioned a whole little
Mhm.
pamphlet. I run a series.
Oh,
The
nice.
series is now concluded. It's called the Dissenting Knowledges Pamphlet Series. And
Mhm.
the foremost Oromo scholar in the world, Gamachu Magarsa, who has written a massive book on Oromo ontology and epistemology. And
Mhm.
Gamachu is a friend I've had for 3 decades. I also have Ethiopian friends who are Amhara. You can
Mhm.
imagine how much conversation, if any, they have between themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, but I can tell you this: from the Oromo standpoint, it's not simply a question of the oppression unleashed by the Amhara. Okay, their contention runs much deeper. It has to do with Ethiopianism. It has to do with the very creation of certain kinds of categories, which in their view are entirely illegitimate because they're completely a creation of Western colonialism. I think the question in Ethiopia also runs much deeper than simply the surface differences between the Amara, the Oromo, the
Yeah.
Tigray, etc., etc. Yeah, yeah,
Well, I definitely didn't mean to. Uh, I mean that's a quote from the book.
yeah,
Where
yeah,
she compared Oromo to Western Sahara to to Kashmir and so on, and I think that's and I love her book. I'll say it very clearly, and I enjoyed talking to her a lot. But I think that is one but it's an example. It's a good example of where you really do have a point in that the details and the various circumstances do matter. And I think, in a lot of ways, the horror of what has unfolded in Gaza has
yeah,
inspired a lot of it, especially younger people who haven't had as much time to read and learn about things to get engaged. And I saw this a lot when the Congo, and now people have forgotten about the Congo again. I think egregiously, but I saw that a lot when there was more discussion about the Congo online, maybe 2 years ago,
mm,
where people really, really, and I'm no expert on the Congo, but people were really, really oversimplifying the situation
yeah,
enormously, and that's a place where the details and the complexities matter
yeah,
immensely,
yeah,
and so I think it is another. Ironically, we're kind of getting back to maybe my initial concern in the question, which is that when you apply the framework, it does actually, it can actually include a lot of the complexities. But then again, if you say, well, there's no analysis necessary and we should kind of ignore this, then, that can serve a specific perspective as well. So there's no easy answer.
all right, yeah. Well, I think maybe we should conclude, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So, quick question for you. I mean, so you post the whole conversation, right? The whole podcast.
Yeah, I think he'll cut it after this, and yeah, I'll post it. But was there
Yeah.
anything you would like cut out or anything?
No, 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 no. Absolutely not. No, no.
Okay.
When do you do that roughly? I mean, how long does it take?
So he does it, and
Uh,
it's I don't expect a cut from anything or anything like that. So that's kind of how it works.
yeah. No,
Uh,
no. What I meant is that when is it actually posted? Does it take a couple of weeks?
I think he'll do it in a week. It depends on his temperament that week.
I see.
It'll be a week or a day, and I'll be sure to email you.
Yeah, yeah.
If you
Please let me know when it's done. Yeah. No, no. I don't want anything cut out. I mean, I know what I'm saying. I'm not, and yeah, I don't worry about, someone listening in and saying, oh, this is what he said about so and so, who's in the Indian government or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
no, no.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's fantastic. I just this morning too. I listened to you're talking about that essay about technology. I found very interesting.
Oh
Thought it
yeah,
was
yeah,
connected
yeah,
very, very interestingly to the kind of cognitive dissonance in Israel now too, in a
yes,
very interesting way. It's a very interesting essay.
yeah.
And I've enjoyed your videos for a long time. So
Yeah,
obviously
well,
it's
thank you. Yeah, no, actually, there should be a lot more coming up now because I hadn't put any for months, and I don't know, I've read 20 interesting books in the last month.
Mhm.
So I'm going to start, and I also have a couple of class lectures which I will put up. For those who are interested. I mean, not the whole series because they were not recorded, most of them, but a couple of them were under certain circumstances. So
Mhm.
and some of them are the class ones are precisely that. So they're meant for undergraduates, but uh, there definitely will be uh, some. I'm gonna do one in a little while on, but I won't tell you right now the full on hunger, um, beginning with hunger in Gaza as a jumping off point to look at the hunger that no one sees. So there's a Adivasi poet from Gujarat who wrote some fabulous poems on hunger, and I'm going to do a short talk on that, this evening. Yeah.
That sounds really great. I look forward
Okay.
to it, and it was obviously very different. Talking to you in person felt a little surreal, but very very enjoyable. And we'd love to have you on to discuss something more focused in the future as well. So it's very nice of you to come on. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. My pleasure. What is it that you do, by the way? I have no idea.
I'm a computer scientist.
I see. By
Yeah,
profession.
yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I just have a lot of interest.
But you obviously read much more widely. Uh, so you had displayed the Fanon book, Dying Colonialism, and Vijay Prasad's book. So Vijay and I, by the way, we did our PhDs together.
Oh, really? Oh,
But
that's fun.
he's 2-3 years younger than me. But
Mhm.
he also studied with Bernard Cohn at
Yeah,
the
it's a really good book. I like it.
University of Chicago. But we have people of different disposition because that is to say that yes, I mean there's a certain kind of left politics, broadly speaking, that we share, but that's about it because he's a card carrying member of the party, if I may put it
Mhm.
this way, and I'm not even remotely close to that. So I also have a resounding critique of the left because I come from a background of reading and knowledge systems which are critical of Marxism
Mhm.
as much as they're critical of racism or conservatism or liberalism,
Yeah.
uh, and so that's the difference. But yeah, no, I mean I recognize, of course, Vijay's presence. We were last together actually in Kerala. We'd both been invited. Um, uh, there were, I think, three international people. They invited Vijay, myself, and one more. I forget who it was.
Mhm.
International conference on Marxism held in Kerala, and so I reconnected with him after many many years. You know,
Hmm.
yeah. Anyhow, on that note, I've really got to get off because it's 2 hours now, and
Yep.
I've got quite a few things I have to do.
All
So
right. Well,
yeah,
sorry to hold you up, and thank you so much. Take care.
okay, bye bye.